Have you ever thought about how to start your speech or how to finish without just saying, okay, I guess that's about it? So, we're actually going to get into that today. So, let's start with what are some common attention getters. So, one is a quote, and it really brings credibility. You're already showing that you did some research with this one. And so, that already makes you seem like, oh, you know what you're talking about. Some negatives are when it's too well known, they lose their impact. So, you really have to watch out for just doing the most common quote that's out there. The fix is that you really want to think about what were the emotions that were behind that quote when that person originally was going to say it, or how does it fit into your speech? And don't just quote dumb, you want to really frame it in your speech to make it meaningful and say it with some passion. Okay. So, how about acknowledging the speaking situation? This is where you kind of set the stage and acknowledge the speaker that's coming up. If you're the MC, you're kind of just saying, we're gathered here today, kind of like for a wedding. The negative is most people know where they're gathered for an event. So it's really not that impactful. It tends to be just filler, in my opinion. And so I would be really careful with this one. It only really works if you're setting the stage and you usually use it as a combo. I wouldn't use it as a standalone because it doesn't necessarily grab the most amount of attention. The next thing is a question, and this one is the most common attention getter, for better or worse. And so this means that it's really well used because it's easy to think of questions. It gets the audience involved when they are doing some kind of interaction with the question. And so it also can be a little bit of stress relief because you have that audience interaction. The negatives, though, as you can see, are plenty. So you have to prepare for many different responses. So, what if you asked a question and then people gave really unexpected answers? I've taught public speaking, and there's been times where somebody asked a question that they thought that they totally knew the answer to. And so they said something like, raise your hand if you play an instrument. And everybody in the class rose their hand. And so then they kind of were taken back of like, all of you already play an instrument, which, is pretty rare. And so just thinking about, ooh, what would you respond if everybody in the audience said something, if nobody said something, if there was a mixture? So you really want to think about how to respond to all those possible scenarios. And then also, if it's a very obvious answer to the question, is it really that useful of a question? You don't want to ask embarrassing questions that you yourself wouldn't really answer. And so you really want to think about that as well and give some indication of how do you want us to answer? Because even in famous TED Talks, a lot of people don't get responses, and it could be very awkward to be waiting, and then right as you're about to go into your next thing, then all of a sudden people are responding to these questions. And so you usually want to say something that takes low effort. So raise your hand if, nod if, clap if, and that's usually easier. When you do shout out if, that's the most risky one. And so you really want to think about what would you do? Do you have enough leeway time to do kind of a shout out if? If it's a rhetorical question, you really want to frame it that way. So say something like, think about, as opposed to if you just said the question, sometimes people will know, oh, that's rhetorical. I don't need to answer. And other people will go, ooh, okay, this is my answer. And then that can create an awkward situation. So really think about if you want to use a question and how to frame the question. And do respond to how they responded. The people sometimes that are answering the question can't always see how other people answered, or it's just a common courtesy of when you ask a question and somebody responds, you should also acknowledge that. So, something to consider. All right, then there's the visualization. So, the positive is it makes the situation real. An audience can have something to picture or even the scope of an issue. And so, this can be really useful. But the negative is it takes a bit of time because you're essentially telling a story and in enough detail that you think that we can picture it. And people have different capabilities of what they can picture in their minds. Some people, when you say picture an apple so deeply that they can take a bite out of that apple. Other people hear picture an apple and they picture the word apple, or they kind of have an icon of an apple. Or some people can't even picture anything and just kind of think of the word apple, or like can understand what you're saying, but not really conceptualize it. Another one that's kind of my personal pet peeve, but I think other people have this too, is we don't need to close our eyes to have a visualization. So when people start off their speech and they go, close your eyes and picture a young man walking through the forest, da 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 da, all that stuff, people often forget to say open your eyes, and it takes a lot of vulnerability to close your eyes around a group of people. So just keep in mind that you can just say visualize this or picture this, and you don't have to say close your eyes and then lead them through it. So those are some tips with visualizations. The next thing is pretty similar, but telling a story. This can be a really great attention getter. This is also really good in the body of your speech. And so you can make it so that you raise credibility, you show that personal interest and investment in your topic. It's appealing to emotions the most, so you get some of the most pathos. The negative is it takes a bit of time, and oftentimes people think you jumped into your speech rather than did an intro to your speech. And so you have to keep them really short. So if you're thinking about a 5 to 7 minute speech, your whole introduction section is about 30 to 45 seconds. So think about how you can tell basically a 15-20 second speech with enough detail that we can get invested in it, but keeping it general enough that we can kind of put ourselves in that position or not to get bogged down in too many details. All right, the next thing is thinking about a joke. So, this is great for a celebratory speech or something where it needs to be lighthearted. And so, you really want to think about the mood when you are going into it. The negative is it's the hardest to pull off. If you're not funny naturally, you're not all of a sudden going to be funny during a speech. So, really consider, can I pull off this joke? Can I deal if most people's reaction to a joke is a deep exhale of, hmm. And so, is that good enough? Or if people don't laugh, is it going to really throw you off your speech? Consider all the things. And then it can create a weird mood if somebody's talking about something serious and yet they went into it with a joke. So, these things can be a little bit awkward. And then the last thing is a fact or statistic. And so this helps you gain credibility. So those ethos, it's good for logically minded people. It helps you when you don't have a personal connection with something, that you have a fact or statistic. Even just eliminating some of that bias towards a topic can be good for showing with a fact or statistic how important the topic is, but it tends to be pretty dry, especially starting off with numbers right away. And you have to cite your sources, especially when it comes to a fact or statistic. So it can be a little bit of a clunky start. So just consider what you're thinking of for your introduction. And then all of these should match your clincher if possible. So you should wrap it back around. So if you started with a quote, maybe refer back to the quote or say, keep those words in mind. If it's acknowledging the speaking situation, you go, I hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening at, and then name the event again, possibly. If it's a question, you can now correct the question or say, now I hope if you're asked that question again in the future, you know the response, or something like that that goes back to the question. With the visualization, you could continue the visualization. You could talk away about a takeaway from that visualization. You could re-show a picture that maybe went along with your visualization that you talked through. So many things for that. Story, same thing. You could continue the story. You could conclude the story. You could do a message from the story. So really good with that. A joke, again, this one is a bit trickier. So you could say a similar joke, or conclude the joke, or do another version of the joke, wrap it back in. This is one where you can tell how comedians do this, of starting off with their strongest joke and then referring back to the joke at the end of their set. Similar thing that you would be doing in your speech. And then fact or statistic, again, you can continue with saying the impact of that fact or statistic that you said in the beginning. You can share a similar fact or statistic, or say something about changing that fact or statistic at the end. So that's how we start off with attention getters and get to our clinchers, with a lot in between.